The security officer didn't look up at first. He was doing what security officers always do, scanning badges, checking faces, running through the routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed 1,000 guests before breakfast. But when he slid my identification card across the reader, something changed. The beep was different. Not the dull electronic chime that cleared ordinary visitors. Something else. A sharper tone. A signal I recognized even though I'd never personally triggered it from this side of the checkpoint. The officer's eyes moved from the screen to my face, then back to the screen. Then he went very still. The kind of still that trained professionals get when something important is happening and they need a moment to process it correctly. He touched his earpiece. Clear the secondary corridor, right now. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Not me. Not my father standing 2 feet to my left. Not the line of guests stretching behind us into the spring morning. It was as if the entire entrance plaza had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Then 4 additional officers appeared, moving with the smooth, deliberate speed of people who don't run but somehow still arrive instantly. The casual murmur of the crowd dissolved. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People stepped sideways without being asked. My father blinked. I've known that blink my entire life. It's the one he does when reality isn't matching the story he's been telling himself. It's involuntary, almost childlike, and in 56 years, I had never seen it look quite so genuinely bewildered. I didn't say a word. I simply retrieved my identification card from the reader, tucked it back into the breast pocket of my jacket, and waited. The lead officer straightened. His voice was formal, respectful, and completely matter-of-fact. "Ma'am, they're expecting you upstairs." My father turned to look at me, then at the officer, then back at me. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For a man who had been confidently explaining my life to other people for 3 decades, he appeared to have run completely out of explanations. If someone had told me, 30 years earlier, that this would be the moment everything finally shifted between us, I would have considered that person dangerously optimistic. Because for most of my adult life, I had been the daughter people moved past on their way to talk about someone else. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway. I was 56 years old that Tuesday morning in April. I had served in the United States Navy for 32 years. I had worked in buildings with armed guards and classified briefings and flags that meant something specific about where authority rested in a room. And my own father still thought I was somebody's administrative assistant. Standing outside the Pentagon in the cool spring light, I couldn't entirely blame him. That's the complicated part. I had spent years allowing the misunderstanding to grow because correcting it required conversations I didn't have the energy for, and because some part of me believed that if my accomplishments needed explaining, then maybe they didn't matter as much as I'd hoped. That's what years of quiet dismissal does to a person. It doesn't break you, it teaches you to build smaller. The morning had begun the way significant mornings often do, looking like nothing special. Washington was behaving itself. Traffic moved. Coffee tasted the way it was supposed to. The Pentagon rose from the landscape the way it always did, enormous and geometric and oddly familiar to anyone who has spent enough time inside it. But today was different. Today was not about meetings or operational reviews or the particular strain of paperwork that defines military bureaucracy. Today was a ceremony. The kind that gets planned in quiet offices by people who don't discuss it publicly, the kind where the invitation list is short and the details are kept close. My family had been invited. Not because they knew what was happening, because I had wanted them there, even after everything, even after all the years of feeling like a footnote at my own family's dinner table. That small, persistent, occasionally infuriating part of me still wanted them present for something that mattered. My official invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. The details were appropriately vague on the portions I was permitted to share. I forwarded what I could, explained what I was allowed to, and let the rest remain classified under the comfortable umbrella of, "It's an important ceremony, please come." My father, Robert Calloway, had asked 2 questions. The first was whether he should wear a suit. The second was whether there would be parking. That was the extent of his curiosity. My father grew up believing certain things about success, not because he was cruel or deliberately narrow-minded, but because the world he came from ran on visible evidence. You could see a business expense. ND, you could read a stock ticker. You could shake hands with a man who owned something and immediately understand where he stood. Military service didn't work that way. The victories were often undisclosed. The sacrifices rarely made it into conversation. The promotions came with new responsibilities that couldn't be fully described, and the work itself existed in spaces most people would never enter. My father's name was Robert. He had built a modest but genuine success running a regional manufacturing operation in western Pennsylvania. He knew how to read a ledger, manage people, negotiate contracts. He understood the language of commerce the way some people understand a native dialect, instinctively, effortlessly, without having to translate. My older brother Thomas spoke that same language. Thomas had gone into commercial real estate, done well, expanded his portfolio, moved into a house with a name instead of a number. He drove vehicles that announced their own price without having to say it. My father and Thomas could spend 4 hours talking about interest rates and zoning laws, and the particular stupidity of various municipal regulations, without once running out of things to say. I never quite fit into that conversation. Not because I was unintelligent, not because I didn't try, but because the world I'd chosen operated on a different frequency, and most of what happened there was either classified, geographically distant, or simply too complicated to summarize over holiday dinner. So conversations about my career tended to go like this. Someone would ask what I was doing. My father would answer before I could. "She's with the Navy." A brief pause, topic change. Thomas would mention something about a property deal. The room would reanimate. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. I had bigger things to focus on. I had work that mattered, even if the people sitting across the Thanksgiving table from me couldn't quite see it. But the truth, the honest truth that I only admitted to myself in quiet hotel rooms after long deployments, was that it did matter. It mattered quite a lot. Because the person whose approval I'd spent my childhood chasing never stopped being my father just because I'd put on a uniform and learned to need less sleep. The first time I knew things were truly imbalanced, I was 17. I had just received an acceptance into a naval ROTC program, a genuinely competitive program, one that required recommendations and physical standards, and a demonstrated commitment to something beyond the ordinary. I had worked for it. I was proud of it in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that 17-year-olds are proud of things before they learn to protect themselves from disappointment. I set the acceptance letter on the kitchen table and waited for my father to come home from work. He came in, loosened his tie, picked up the letter and read it. "That's nice, Maggie," he said. Put it down, went to wash his hands, asked what was for dinner. That was it. The next morning, Thomas mentioned he was thinking about buying a pickup truck for a lawn care business he was considering starting. My father spent the better part of the afternoon discussing truck models, insurance rates, client acquisition strategies, and the particular economics of residential versus commercial lawn contracts. I sat at the counter and ate cereal, and understood something quietly and permanently. It wasn't that my father didn't love me. He did, in his way. It was that my dreams occupied a category he simply hadn't assigned value to, and no amount of achievement was going to reorganize his filing system. I left for officer candidate school the following year, and didn't spend much emotional energy waiting for his attention to arrive. Except I did. Obviously I did, because you don't stop wanting your parents to see you just because you've decided it's inefficient. At my commissioning ceremony, my mother cried in the second row and pressed her hand against her heart. My father shook my hand. A handshake, firm and brief, and the exact thing you'd give a business associate you respected, but didn't particularly know. I told myself he was simply reserved. Some people express love through action rather than words. Some fathers communicate pride through presence rather than demonstration. I told myself that, for approximately 20 years, before I ran out of convincing myself. What followed those early years was a career that I am not permitted to describe in its full complexity, and wouldn't describe even if I were, because some experiences belong to the people who lived them. But I can tell you this. I served in places where the weather had no polite season. I led teams through situations where the margin between a good decision and a catastrophic one was measured in seconds. I mentored officers who later held commands of their own. I helped design programs that influenced how the Navy trained, equipped, and deployed PO. In ways that outlasted my direct involvement. After September of 2001, the nature of everything changed, including the work. I volunteered for assignments that kept me far from home for extended periods. I missed holidays I cannot get back. I attended memorial services for people I had worked beside who did not come home from places I cannot name. I am not recounting this to claim exceptional heroism. There were people around me every day who carried heavier loads and asked for less acknowledgement. I am recounting it because it is the truth of the 32 years that my father summarized as "she's with the Navy" every time a relative asked. Meanwhile, Thomas continued building his real estate portfolio. His name appeared in local business publications. He joined civic boards, sponsored charity events, showed up at family gatherings with new stories about deals completed and opportunities pursued. My father attended every ribbon-cutting Thomas organized. He flew across the country for a building dedication. He showed up. For my promotions, he sent cards, sometimes. I stopped expecting him at ceremonies somewhere around the 15th year. It became easier once I stopped tracking the absence. But the worst moment, the one I've turned over in my mind the most often, came during a Thanksgiving about 12 years ago. I had just received a significant promotion, the kind that comes with new stars and new responsibilities, and a very short list of people who have ever held the position. I had worked toward it for years. I was proud of it in the way you're proud of something that cost you a great deal. I arrived at my parents' house with the news. I wasn't going to announce it dramatically. I simply hoped someone would ask about my work and I'd have something genuine to share. Thomas arrived 20 minutes after me and announced he was opening a fourth office location. My father raised his glass. Everyone applauded. I passed the mashed potatoes and helped my mother with the dishes afterward and drove back to my hotel and sat on the edge of the bed in my uniform and felt a loneliness so specific and familiar it was almost like visiting a room I knew too well. It wasn't jealousy. I want to be clear about that. Thomas worked hard and built something real and deserved every bit of recognition he received. What I felt was the particular sadness of invisibility, of being in a room full of people who loved you and still somehow not being fully seen. That feeling followed me onto planes and across oceans and into situations where I needed to be completely present. I got quite good at setting it aside. You learn that, in the military. You learn to compartmentalize the things that would cost you your focus if you allowed them to stay in the foreground. But compartmentalization is not healing. It's just good storage. The officer who escorted me through the secured corridor moved with the efficient calm that distinguishes career military personnel from everyone else. Not rushed, not showy, just purposeful. The hallways of the Pentagon have a particular quality I've never been able to fully describe to civilians. They feel simultaneously bureaucratic and historic, functional and weighty, like the building itself is aware of what it has witnessed and wants you to remain appropriately aware of it too. I was placed in a reception room reserved for ceremony participants. A Navy captain brought coffee. I took it and sat near a window and let the memories surface that the morning had stirred loose. The captain informed me the ceremony would begin in just under an hour. My phone showed a text from my mother. "Your father has been asking questions since you went inside. He doesn't look comfortable." I stared at that message for a long moment. Then I put my phone away and looked out the window and thought about what it had cost me to get to this room, and what it might cost me to be honest once the morning was over. The waiting room door opened at precisely 10 o'clock. A civilian aide appeared and smiled with the particular brightness of someone who is professionally optimistic. "Ma'am, we're ready for you." I stood, adjusted my jacket, checked the alignment of the decorations on my chest, each one a small compressed record of something that had happened somewhere, at some cost, and followed her into the corridor. The auditorium filled as we approached. I recognized faces. Some I knew personally, colleagues from assignments spanning 2 decades. Others I recognized by reputation, the particular posture and bearing that senior military leadership tends to produce in people who have carried enough responsibility for long enough. A retired general stopped me near the entrance. "Margaret," he smiled, offering his hand. "Good to see you here, very well deserved." I thanked him and kept moving, but I noticed the effect his greeting had on the people nearby. Military communities are small. Attention flows in particular directions. When someone with 4 stars pauses to greet you warmly, people notice. Inside the auditorium, the flags were positioned behind the stage. The military band arranged themselves quietly in the corner. Programs had been placed on each seat, cream-colored, crisply folded, containing names and citations and the formal language that turns a life of service into a document. I was guided to the reserved section near the front. And that's when I allowed myself, just briefly, to think about my father sitting somewhere in this room, holding one of those programs, reading through names he didn't recognize and citations he didn't have context for, approaching the one name he did recognize in a context he had never anticipated. I wondered what that felt like. I found I didn't feel triumphant about it. I felt something closer to tired. The good kind, the kind that comes after something has gone on too long and is finally, slowly, coming to a close. My family arrived, while the auditorium was still filling. I spotted them from across the room. My mother, composed as always, scanning the space with the careful attention of someone who knows she's about to learn something important. Thomas, beside her, already looking slightly out of his depth. My father, wearing his best dark suit, moving through the room with the comfortable authority of a man who has spent his life knowing which rooms he belonged in. He scanned the audience. His eyes found me. Specifically, they found where I was sitting, in the reserved section, surrounded by retired admirals and senior defense officials, and the particular category of person that does not end up in that location by accident. His expression shifted the way expressions do when the brain is processing something it wasn't prepared for. Not dramatically, just enough. He kept looking. I watched him locate a program, watched him open it, watched his eyes move down the page with the methodical progress of someone who is reading carefully because they're not quite sure what they're looking for. Then they stopped. He looked up at the stage, then back at the program, then at me. And I thought, there it is, that's the moment. Not the ceremony, not the award, not the recognition from people who had spent their careers building and protecting things most Americans would never directly see. That moment, right there, my father holding a program, reading my name in a place he hadn't imagined it could be, feeling the ground shift under a story he had been telling himself for 30 years. The ceremony opened with the national anthem. Everyone stood. The room smelled faintly of the particular combination of wool and institutional air conditioning that has been the ambient scent of official Washington since anyone can remember. When we sat again, a senior Pentagon official moved to the podium. He spoke about service, not in the abstract, flag-waving way politicians sometimes do, but with the quiet specificity of someone who has seen what service actually requires of people. He spoke about commitment made in conditions that aren't comfortable, over periods of time that outlast most people's patience. He spoke about the gap between what this work asks of people and what the public typically understands about it. I thought about every person I'd worked beside who deserved to be in a room like this and never would be, for any number of reasons: rank, circumstances, the particular unlucky timing of careers that ended before recognition caught up to them. The first several awards were presented. Individuals walked to the stage, their families applauded from the audience. Photographs were taken, life compressed into small official moments. Then the official returned to the podium, and the room became noticeably quieter. I have attended enough ceremonies to know when an audience is paying particular attention, the quality of silence changes. People stop shifting in their seats. The next recognition, the official said, honors a career that has shaped this institution at every level. I kept my eyes forward. The recipient has served in multiple commands across 3 decades, providing leadership, strategic direction, and the kind of sustained institutional knowledge that cannot be replaced or easily replicated. In my peripheral vision, I could see my father's posture changing, becoming more upright, more attentive. Their work has influenced how this Navy trains its officers, how it deploys its capabilities, and how it develops the next generation of leaders. The impact of that work extends into commands and positions and decisions that will continue long after any official title has passed. The room was completely still. It is my honor to present this recognition to Rear Admiral Margaret Ellen Calloway. The applause started before I had fully risen from my seat. And then it grew. I've been in rooms where people clap politely. This was different. This was the sound of a professional community expressing something genuine, the particular respect that accumulates over decades of watching someone do difficult work without complaint, make hard calls without credit, and show up reliably in circumstances where many others would have found excellent reasons not to. I walked to the stage, and for just a moment, as I passed the row where my family sat, I let myself look. My mother had her hand pressed to her mouth. Thomas was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in my entire life. Something between awe and the particular discomfort of realizing you have significantly underestimated someone you thought you knew completely. My father. My father was sitting perfectly still, and the expression on his face was not the confusion I'd seen at the security gate, and it was not the bewilderment I'd seen when he read the program. It was something older and quieter and more complicated than either of those things. It was the expression of a man confronting the full weight of what he had missed. I reached the stage, I shook hands, I accepted the recognition. I stood where you stand for photographs when the occasion is official and the moment is permanent. And then the official asked if I'd like to say a few words. I hadn't planned a speech. I don't believe in prepared vulnerability. It tends to come out sounding like a performance. But I stepped forward anyway because there were things I needed to say, even if I couldn't say all of them, even if the most important ones would have to wait for a different room and a smaller audience. I've spent most of my career surrounded by people who will never stand at a podium like this one, I said. People who made this work possible and whose names don't appear in any official record. The room was quiet. Service isn't something that happens to you. It's a decision you renew every day, sometimes every hour. It costs things you can't itemize in a citation. I paused. But it also gives you things you can't fully explain to people who haven't chosen it. A few nods in the audience. The kind that mean yes, exactly, I know precisely what you mean. I'm grateful to the people who taught me what it looked like to do this well, and I'm grateful to everyone who made it possible for me to be here. I looked out across the room, briefly, just once, toward my family's row. Everyone. I stepped back. The applause returned. And somewhere in the third row from the back, on the left side of the auditorium, my father began, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who is working through something in real time, to put together a picture that should have been assembled 3 decades earlier. The auditorium cleared gradually, the way formal rooms always do, conversations resuming, programs being folded into jacket pockets, small clusters forming and dissolving as people found who they were looking for. I stayed near the stage longer than I needed to, partly because people kept stopping to speak with me, partly because I needed a moment to breathe before the conversation I knew was coming. A retired vice admiral, 2 officers I'd mentored early in their careers, a civilian director I'd worked with on a joint program 5 years ago, each stopped briefly, each offered something genuine, each moved on. Eventually, the crowd thinned enough that there was no more reasonable delay. My family stood near the back wall. My mother reached me first. She put both arms around me and held on for a moment longer than a casual embrace requires. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet and her expression carried the particular weight of a woman who has been keeping a secret, not because she was asked to, but because she understood some truths are best revealed on their own terms. I am so proud of you, she said. I have always been so proud of you. I know, Mom. Thomas stepped forward next. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life being comfortable in rooms, and right now he looked genuinely, authentically uncomfortable, and I respected him more for it than I had in years. Maggie, he stopped, started again. I didn't know. I know you didn't. I mean, he gestured vaguely at the auditorium, the flags, the stage, the ceremony that had just concluded. I didn't know any of this. No. He ran a hand through his hair. I should have asked. It was a simple thing to say. It was also precisely the right thing, and I knew it cost him something to say it because Thomas had never been in the habit of acknowledging the limits of what he understood. Yeah, I said, you probably should have. He nodded, I'm sorry. Then my father. He hadn't moved from where he was standing. When my mother and Thomas stepped back, he remained in place, this man who had always moved through rooms as though he owned the air inside them, now standing at the edge of a space he wasn't sure how to enter. He was 78 years old, his hair had been white for a decade, the suit he'd worn was the good one, the one he'd bought for Thomas's building dedication 3 years ago. He looked at me across a distance of about 6 feet that felt, in that moment, considerably longer. Maggie. Just my name, the way he'd said it my entire life, 2 syllables that meant different things in different decades. I waited. He cleared his throat, looked briefly at the stage, looked back at me. I didn't know, he said. I held his gaze. I know you didn't. He shook his head slowly. No, I mean, his voice caught slightly and he pressed his mouth together for a moment. I didn't know any of it, not the rank, not what you were doing, not what any of it meant. I didn't move toward him. Not yet. Because I needed to hear this fully, and I needed him to say it completely, and I'd spent 30 years having things left half-finished in conversations about my life. I thought, he stopped, I thought I had a picture of what you were doing, what it all looked like. Another pause. I was wrong. The auditorium was almost empty now. A few staff members moving chairs in the background. The military band packing equipment in the corner. The flags still standing behind the stage in the particular stillness that flags have when a ceremony is finished. Were there other ceremonies? He asked. The question surprised me. What? Promotions, he looked almost pained asking it. Important moments, things I should have been at. I thought about a specific evening in late autumn, about 12 years earlier. A change of command ceremony where I had scanned an audience of 300 people looking for 2 faces and found neither of them. I thought about a promotion that happened at a ceremony in Norfolk where my mother came alone. I thought about a retirement dinner for a mentor I'd wanted my father to meet, a man who had shaped my understanding of leadership more than anyone else I'd ever encountered, who had died 18 months later without my father ever knowing he existed. There were a few, I said. His jaw tightened. He looked down at the floor. When he looked back up, his eyes were doing something I had never seen them do in my entire life. I'm sorry, Maggie. Not the kind of sorry that wants to move past the uncomfortable moment. The kind that comes from somewhere that has had to travel a long distance to reach the surface. I built a picture of your life from what I could see, from what was easy to see, and I stopped looking for what I couldn't. He paused. That was wrong. It was wrong for a long time. I breathed. I know why you did it, I said. That doesn't make it. No, I agreed. It doesn't, but I understand it. He looked at me with something I can only describe as relief, the kind that comes when someone extends grace they weren't sure they deserved. Can you? He hesitated. Can we talk, really talk? I want to know about it, about your career, about all of it. I looked at my father. This complicated, stubborn, occasionally infuriating man who had shaped me in ways I was still discovering, and I felt the weight of 30 years pressing against the possibility of whatever came next. Yes, I said, we can do that. 3 weeks after the ceremony, my father called me. Not a text, not a message relayed through my mother. An actual phone call, which from my father carried the same significance as a formal written statement from most other people. There was a long silence after I picked up. Then, do you have time for lunch next week? I said yes. We met at a diner that sat at the midpoint between where I was staying and my parents' home. The kind of place where the coffee is reliably mediocre, and the pie is unexpectedly excellent, and nobody cares what you're wearing or how important you are in a room that isn't this one. He arrived before me and was sitting in a corner booth when I walked in, turning a coffee cup in circles the way he does when he's nervous. I sat down. He looked at me across the table, with the expression of a man attempting to begin a conversation. He's not entirely sure how to begin. Tell me about your career, he said. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it had taken 32 years and a Pentagon ceremony for those 5 words to arrive, and they were both the simplest thing he could have said, and the thing I had waited longest to hear. So I told him. Not everything. Some of it belongs to other people. Some of it remains beyond what I'm permitted to share in any context. But I told him what I could, the places I'd served, the things those places had required, the people who had shaped how I approached the work, the decisions I'd been trusted to make, and the weight those decisions carried. He listened for nearly 2 hours. Not politely, not with the distracted patience of someone waiting for their turn to speak. He listened the way people listen when they understand they are getting something back that they'd forfeited without realizing it. He asked follow-you questions, good ones, the kind that show comprehension. When I mentioned a particular assignment, he asked about the logistics. When I described a leadership challenge, he asked what approach I'd taken and why. When I talked about losses, the people who hadn't come home, the decisions that had cost something, he went quiet in a way that acknowledged the gravity without reaching for inadequate words. By the time the pie arrived, something between us had shifted. Not dramatically, not in the storybook way where old wounds close instantly and the past is rearranged into something more comfortable, but genuinely, the way things shift when two people who have been talking past each other for years finally find the frequency they were both looking for. I owe you more than lunch, he said at one point. Probably, I agreed. He almost smiled. I'm serious. I know you are. He looked down at his coffee. I had a fixed idea of what success looked like, what it was worth, how to measure it. He shook his head. I spent 30 years applying that idea to your life without ever checking whether it fit. I let that sit. It didn't fit, I said. No, he met my eyes, it didn't. That afternoon was the first of several. We talked on the phone. We met for lunch again. He asked to see photographs from my career, the ones I was permitted to share, and I brought albums I hadn't opened in years, images from assignments and ceremonies and unlikely corners of the world that had shaped me. He studied each one carefully. At one point, he picked up a photograph from about 15 years back. I was standing with a group of officers after a major operational milestone, everyone sun-worn and tired, and clearly satisfied in the specific way that comes after something difficult is finished. My father looked at that photograph for a long time. You look like you're exactly where you're supposed to be, he said quietly. I was. He set the photograph down slowly. I never understood that about you, what it feels like to be somewhere you're genuinely supposed to be. He paused. I think I assumed you must have felt what I would have felt, doing what you were doing, being away, missing things. I missed things, I confirmed. But I didn't feel what you'd have felt doing it. It was my work, my choice, my place. He nodded slowly, processing. I couldn't see it because I was looking through the wrong lens. That was the most honest thing he'd said in 30 years. I didn't point that out. It didn't need pointing out. Summer came the way it always does in that part of the country. Suddenly, and without apology. My parents hosted a family gathering in late July. Nothing ceremonial. Burgers on the grill, folding tables in the backyard, the grandchildren doing the particular kind of running that children do when the yard is large enough and nobody is telling them to be careful. I wore civilian clothes, jeans, a light jacket. Nobody addressed me by rank. It was exactly what it should have been. At some point in the afternoon, I went inside to refill a pitcher of iced tea. As I came back through the kitchen toward the back door, I heard my father's voice coming from the living room. I stopped. He was talking to two of my nieces and nephews, my brother's kids, the older ones, the ones who were at the age where adults become interesting rather than merely obligatory. They had apparently noticed the framed photograph that now sat on the living room shelf, a photograph from the Pentagon ceremony that my mother had printed and framed without telling anyone. One of my nieces was asking about it. I stood in the kitchen doorway and listened. Your Aunt Margaret, my father said, spent 32 years serving this country. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Quieter, more careful, like someone carrying something fragile who has learned, recently, exactly how fragile it is. She went to places most people never see and did work most people will never know about. One of the kids asked something I couldn't quite hear. Was she important? That one I caught. My father made a sound that might have been a small laugh. Yes, he said, but not because of her rank. A pause. Because she showed up every day for 32 years and did the work correctly, even when nobody was watching, even when it cost her things. His voice steadied. Especially then. I stood in the kitchen with a pitcher of iced tea, and I did not cry. I was very deliberate about not crying. I have spent 32 years being deliberate about things when it mattered. But I stayed there in the doorway for a moment longer than I needed to. Because that was it. That was the sentence. The one I had been waiting for since I was 17 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with an acceptance letter and a set of hopes I didn't yet know how to protect. Not the Pentagon, not the award, not the standing ovation from people whose entire professional lives had prepared them. To understand exactly what that moment represented. She showed up and did the work correctly, even when nobody was watching. My father said it to children who barely knew my name. He said it quietly, in a living room, over a framed photograph, because he had finally arrived at the understanding that had taken him 30 years to reach. That was enough. More than enough. Later that evening, we sat together on the back porch. The grandchildren were chasing fireflies in the darkening yard. The smell of charcoal and cut grass hung in the warm air. Inside, my mother was organizing leftovers with the focused efficiency she brings to all domestic operations. My father settled into the chair beside mine. For a while neither of us said anything, which was its own kind of progress, because for most of my life our silences had been uncomfortable, full of things we weren't saying. This one was different. It had room in it. I spent a long time, he said eventually, believing that if I couldn't see something clearly, it probably wasn't there. I watched a firefly blink near the fence line. I understand that, I said. Do you? You built things you could touch and measure and point to. That made sense as a standard. I paused. My work didn't fit that standard, so you assumed it didn't measure up. He was quiet for a moment. I never once considered that the standard might be wrong. Most people don't. They measure everything against what they know. I should have known more about you. The simplicity of that sentence landed somewhere deep. Yes, I agreed, you should have. I'm sorry it took this long. I turned to look at him. My father, 78 years old, sitting in the evening air, carrying the particular weariness of someone who has recently had to revise a significant portion of what they thought was true. I'm glad it didn't take longer, I said. He nodded slowly, then, after a long moment, thank you for not, he stopped, considered, for not giving up on being here. I thought about all the Thanksgivings where I'd passed the mashed potatoes and helped clear the table. All the Christmas dinners where I'd smiled and asked about Thomas's latest project. All the phone calls I'd answered that lasted 12 minutes and covered nothing real. All the times I'd gotten back on a plane and flown to a place I couldn't name and done work I couldn't fully describe and reminded myself that the life I was living was sufficient, was more than sufficient, was meaningful in ways that didn't require outside verification. "I'm your daughter," I said. "Where else was I going to be?" He looked at me with something I don't quite have a word for, something between gratitude and grief. The expression of a man who understands, clearly and fully, what he was given and what he spent too long failing to recognize. There's something I've come to understand about the people we overlook. They don't disappear when we stop paying attention. They go somewhere else, do something else, become something else. They build lives in the spaces we weren't looking, and those lives are fully real, fully significant, fully underway regardless of whether we've tuned in to witness them. My father thought he had a complete picture of his daughter's life, because he could see the edges of it from where he was standing. He didn't understand that the part he couldn't see was larger than the part he could, and that what was hidden wasn't hidden because it was unimportant, but because it operated in a world that didn't announce itself in the ways he'd learned to recognize. That morning at the Pentagon, he asked a question that he thought was rhetorical. "Who invited you here?" The answer turned out to be 32 years of service, tens of thousands of hours of work, decisions made in conditions he couldn't imagine, and the kind of sustained commitment that earns its own invitation without requiring permission from anyone. I didn't arrive at those gates as somebody's guest. I arrived as myself. The daughter he had underestimated, the officer who had showed up anyway, every day, in places he couldn't find on a map, the woman who had spent 3 decades building something real in a world he hadn't thought to look at. And the greatest part of that day wasn't the award, though I am proud of it. It wasn't the recognition from peers who understood what it represented, though that mattered more than I expected. The greatest part was this: my father asked me to lunch 3 weeks later. He wanted to hear the whole story. He sat in a corner booth with a bad cup of coffee and listened for 2 hours like his life depended on what he was about to learn. That's not a small thing. That's a man who chose, at 78, to become someone capable of seeing what he'd missed. That requires a particular kind of courage, the kind that doesn't come with any ceremony or official recognition, the kind that happens quietly in a vinyl booth over mediocre coffee and turns out to be its own form of service. Forgiveness is not the erasure of what happened. It doesn't rearrange the past into something more comfortable. The promotions he missed are still missed. The ceremonies he didn't attend still happen without him. The Thanksgiving where I cleared dishes while Thomas's fourth office location got a toast, that evening is still part of my history, permanently. What forgiveness offers is not a revised history. What it offers is a different future. And sometimes, after long enough, a different future is the most remarkable thing imaginable. My father told his grandchildren that I showed up and did the work correctly, even when nobody was watching. He was right. But here's the other part, the part he couldn't have known when he said it. I kept showing up at his table too, year after year, quietly, without announcement, without the recognition that might have made it easier, because he was my father, because love doesn't require a perfect recipient, because some things you do not because they're comfortable but because they matter. And because some part of me, the 17-year-old with the acceptance letter, the woman who scanned ceremony audiences looking for faces that weren't there, never entirely stopped believing that he would eventually find his way to really seeing me. He did. It took 30 years and a Tuesday morning in April, and a security scanner that made 4 officers materialize from nowhere, and my father standing on the wrong side of a checkpoint, asking a question he thought he already knew the answer to. But he got there. And sometimes that's the whole story. Sometimes the ending you stopped letting yourself hope for arrives quietly, in a diner, over bad coffee and excellent pie, between a father who finally asked and a daughter who finally had the space to answer. If there is someone in your life whose story you've assumed you already know, I want to gently suggest that you might be wrong. The most significant chapters are often the ones that happen in places you weren't watching. The most remarkable people are often the ones who have learned to carry their accomplishments quietly, because the alternative required more energy than the work itself. Ask the question, mean it when you ask it. The answer might change everything. And if you have ever had to earn your place in a room that should have always had space for you, I see you. I know what that costs. I know the particular arithmetic of showing up for people who aren't fully showing up for you, and choosing to do it anyway, not because you need their validation, but because the alternative is a version of yourself you don't want to become. You are not invisible. You are exactly where 30 years of excellent work placed you. That's your own invitation, no one else's to give or withhold. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story brought someone to mind, someone you've underestimated, or someone who has never stopped believing in you, I hope you'll reach out to them today. Your story has the same power to reach someone who needs it. Share it if it moved you.